On a summer morning in 1944, American bomber crews approaching their target over Germany witnessed something that defied everything they knew about aviation. A small aircraft appeared from below, climbing toward them at an impossible angle, and impossible speed estimates would later suggest over 600 miles per hour in a vertical climb faster than anything that had ever flown. Within seconds, this strange craft shot past the bomber formation, rolled over at the apex of its climb, and dove back through the formations, firing cannon that barely had time to aim before the target flashed by. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the aircraft's engine shut off, transforming the interceptor into a glider that drifted away from the bombers it had been attacking, helpless and vulnerable, as American fighters pounced on it like wolves bringing down wounded prey. This was the Messerschmitt Me Komet Nazi, Germany's rocket-powered interceptor, an aircraft so revolutionary and so flawed that it represented both the pinnacle of German innovation and the desperation of a losing war. It could climb to 30,000 feet in less than 3 minutes, reach speeds that would not be matched for years, and execute maneuvers that no other aircraft could achieve. It could also kill its pilot through fuel system explosions, landing gear collapses, or simple fuel starvation that left it defenseless against any Allied fighter. The Me-163 killed more German pilots than Allied bombers, yet it remained in production until the war's end. Because Germany had no other option, conventional interceptors couldn't reach Allied bombers fast enough, and desperation drove innovation past the point of practicality into the realm of deadly experimentation. This is the story of the aircraft that flew too fast, the rocket interceptor that revolutionized aviation while killing the men who flew it. To understand why Germany developed such a radical aircraft, you need to understand the strategic situation that made it necessary. By 1943, Allied strategic bombing of Germany was intensifying, with American bombers attacking in daylight and British bombers attacking at night, systematically destroying German industrial capacity and urban centers. German fighter defenses were being overwhelmed not through superior Allied tactics, but through simple numbers the Allies could afford, losses that would have been catastrophic to Germany, and they could replace aircraft and crews faster than Germany could shoot them down. Conventional German interceptors like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were effective, but required substantial time to climb to the altitudes where bomber formations operated, often arriving too late to intercept or with insufficient fuel for sustained combat. What Germany needed was an interceptor that could reach bomber altitude, almost instantly attack before escorts could react, and land quickly to rearm for another sortie. The solution proposed by aircraft designer Alexander Lippisch was radical beyond anything attempted before. A rocket-powered interceptor that would climb nearly vertically to bomber altitude, make a single high-speed attack pass, and then glide back to base unpowered. The concept abandoned conventional aircraft design principles entirely. There would be no propeller, a liquid-fueled rocket engine would provide thrust. The airframe would be as small and light as possible to maximize performance. A stubby tailless design with swept wings that looked more like a dart or arrowhead than a conventional aircraft. Endurance would be sacrificed completely for speed and climb rate. The rocket engine would run for only a few minutes before fuel exhaustion, after which the aircraft would become a glider. It was an insane concept that violated every principle of practical combat aircraft design, and it was exactly what Germany's desperate situation required. The aircraft that emerged from this concept was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, and its appearance was unlike any other fighter in the world. The fuselage was a short, fat cylinder barely 19 feet long, containing the cockpit fuel tanks and rocket engine. The wings were swept back at 35 degrees, a radical design feature in an era when most aircraft had straight wings, and gave the Komet a wingspan of just 30 feet. There was no tail to the swept wings, and a single vertical stabilizer provided control, making the aircraft appear unfinished, as if someone had forgotten to attach the rear fuselage. The entire aircraft weighed barely 4,200 pounds empty and 9,500 pounds fully loaded, about half the weight of contemporary fighters. It looked dangerous and wrong, as if it shouldn't be able to fly at all, let alone fly faster than anything else in the sky. The heart of the Me-163 was its Walter HWK 109-509A rocket engine, a marvel of engineering and a death trap in equal measure. The engine burned two liquid propellants that were pumped into a combustion chamber, where they reacted violently to produce thrust. The fuels used, designated T-Stoff and C-Stoff in German terminology, were among the most dangerous substances ever put into an aircraft. T-Stoff was concentrated hydrogen peroxide, an incredibly reactive oxidizer that would spontaneously ignite on contact with organic materials. And that was so corrosive, it would eat through metal skin and virtually anything else. C-Stoff was a mixture of methanol hydrazine hydrate and water that was only slightly less dangerous. When mixed in the combustion chamber, these propellants produced 3,750 pounds of thrust, an extraordinary amount for such a small engine, and exhaust temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. The performance these fuels enabled was unprecedented. The Me 163 could accelerate from standstill to over 500 miles per hour in seconds. Its rate of climb approached 16,000 feet per minute under full power, meaning it could reach 30,000 feet the altitude, where American bomber formations typically operated in less than 3 minutes from takeoff. Maximum speed was officially listed at 596 miles per hour, but pilots reported achieving speeds over 600 mph in dives, making the Komet the first aircraft to exceed 600 miles per hour in level flight. These speeds were achieved in 1944 years before jet fighters would routinely operate at such velocities, and they made the Me 163 effectively immune to interception by conventional Allied fighters during its powered climb and attack. But these extraordinary capabilities came with fatal compromises. The rocket engine consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. Full fuel load provided only about 8 minutes of powered flight, and attacking at full throttle reduced this to as little as 5 minutes. This meant the Me 163's operational profile was brutally constrained. Take-off climb rapidly to intercept altitude, make a single attack pass lasting perhaps 30 seconds, and then glide back to base unpowered. There was no margin for error, no possibility of extended combat, no chance to pursue damaged bombers or evade pursuing fighters once the fuel ran out. And the fuel itself was so dangerous that merely carrying it was life-threatening. The chemical properties of the propellants made them nightmares to handle. T-Stoff would explode or catch fire spontaneously if it came into contact with organic materials. This included leather fabric paper or human flesh. Ground crew handling the fuel wore protective suits that resembled primitive hazmat gear, and even with precautions, accidents were common. C-Stoff was somewhat less reactive, but could still cause chemical burns and was toxic if inhaled. The slightest fuel leak inside the aircraft meant the pilot was sitting in a container of substances that could kill him instantly if they came into contact with each other or with any contaminant. Combat damage that punctured fuel lines or tanks would cause the propellants to mix uncontrollably, resulting in explosions that vaporized the aircraft and pilot together. The takeoff procedure for the Me 163 reflected both the aircraft's radical design and its operational constraints. The Komet used a wheeled dolly for takeoff, a detachable wheeled carriage that supported the aircraft until it was airborne, at which point the dolly was jettisoned and recovered for reuse. This saved weight compared to retractable landing gear and simplified the aircraft's structure, but it created its own dangers. If the dolly failed to separate cleanly, it could damage the aircraft or cause loss of control. On landing, the Me 163 descended on a retractable skid, essentially a reinforced metal blade that extended from the fuselage belly and slid along the ground to dissipate the aircraft's momentum. Landing on a skid was inherently risky, requiring precise speed control and touchdown on prepared surfaces, and even successful landings subjected the pilot to violent deceleration and the aircraft to structural stress. The operational procedure for a typical Me 163 mission demonstrated the aircraft's extreme specialization and the narrow parameters within which it could function. The Komet would be armed with two 30mm Mk108 Cannon slow-firing weapons, that packed enormous destructive power with a single shell capable of destroying or severely damaging a heavy bomber. The pilot, wearing a pressure suit necessary for operations above 30,000 feet and protective gear against the toxic fuels, would be sealed into the tiny cockpit and have fuel loaded. At the alarm indicating incoming bombers, the Me-163 would take off using the wheeled dolly, which would separate after the aircraft was airborne. The rocket engine would ignite, and the pilot would point the nose nearly vertical, climbing at angles that would have stalled any conventional aircraft, but that the Komet could sustain through sheer thrust. Within 2 to 3 minutes, the M163 would be at bomber altitude, approaching the formation at speeds that gave bomber gunners almost no time to track and fire. The attack itself lasted only seconds. The Komet would flash through the bomber formation at closing speeds exceeding 600 mph, the pilot firing brief bursts from the 30mm cannon and hoping to hit something in the instant he was in range. Then the rocket engine would shut off, either because fuel was exhausted or because the pilot throttled back to conserve fuel for potential second pass, and the Me-163 would transform into a glider with mediocre handling characteristics and no ability to accelerate or climb. This transition from supersonic interceptor to vulnerable glider was the Komet's fundamental tactical weakness. Once unpowered, the Me-163 couldn't effectively defend itself. It could dive away from pursuing fighters using its excellent glide ratio and energy retention to extend, but any Allied fighter that caught the Komet during its glide could shoot it down with relative ease. American pilots learned to ignore the Me-163 during its powered climb and attack. There was no point trying to intercept something that was climbing at 16,000 feet per minute, and instead to wait for the engine to shut off, then pounce on the gliding interceptor when it was helpless. Many Me-163s were shot down during their descent to base, with pilots unable to defend themselves beyond basic evasive maneuvers that consumed precious altitude they needed to reach their airfield. The landing phase was perhaps the most dangerous moment of any Me-163 flight. The aircraft had to descend unpowered. There was no fuel for a go-around if the approach was botched, and execute a precise landing on the skid at speeds around 130 mph. The touchdown had to be on the centerline of the runway, because any sideways motion would cause the skid to catch and flip the aircraft, probably killing the pilot. The surface had to be smooth, because irregularities could cause the skid to dig in again, resulting in a flip. Even successful landings were violent, with the pilot subjected to several Gs of deceleration as the skid scraped along the runway. And throughout this process, the aircraft still contained residual amounts of the deadly propellants that could explode from landing shock or from any leak bringing them into contact with each other. The casualty statistics for Me-163 pilots were appalling and made the aircraft one of the war's deadliest for its own pilots. Out of approximately 370 Me-163s delivered to Luftwaffe units, only about 9 Allied aircraft were confirmed destroyed by Komet attacks. Meanwhile, dozens of Me-163 pilots were killed in training accidents, fuel explosions, landing crashes, and combat losses to Allied fighters that caught them during their vulnerable glide phase. The kill ratio, the number of friendly pilots killed versus enemy aircraft destroyed, was worse than any other combat aircraft in history. Pilots dreaded flying the Komet, knowing that their greatest enemy wasn't Allied fighters, but their own aircraft's fundamental design compromises and deadly fuel system. The specific ways the Me-163 killed its pilots read like a catalogue of aerospace engineering nightmares. Fuel system leaks during flight would allow T-stoff and C-stoff to mix in the fuselage, causing explosions that destroyed the aircraft instantly, with no warning and no chance for the pilot to bail out. Landing gear dolly failures during takeoff could cause loss of control at low altitude, where recovery was impossible. The skid landing system would sometimes catch on runway irregularities, flipping the aircraft and breaking the pilot's spine or neck. Combat damage that would merely disable conventional fighters would cause catastrophic fuel explosions in the Me-163. Engine failures during the critical climb phase would leave the aircraft without power, but with full fuel load, creating a gliding bomb that had to be landed immediately with hundreds of pounds of explosive propellant still aboard. Even successful missions were physically punishing. The acceleration during takeoff and climb subjected pilots to forces approaching 4 Gs, sustained for minutes, exhausting even experienced pilots. The tiny cockpit was cramped beyond anything in conventional fighters, making long missions physically impossible even if fuel had been available. The lack of pressurization meant pilots needed oxygen systems that sometimes failed at high altitude. The extreme speeds achieved during attack passes made control difficult at 600 Messerschmitt Me. The Me-163's controls stiffened dramatically, and pilot inputs had to be gentle to avoid over-controlling and losing control entirely. And the psychological stress of flying an aircraft that might explode at any moment, that would certainly become defenseless within minutes, and that required perfect execution of dangerous landing procedures just to survive, created mental strain that affected pilot performance and decision-making. The tactical impact of the Me-163, despite all its flaws, was sufficient to concern Allied planners. The Komet forced bomber formations to maintain tighter defensive formations and to coordinate more closely with fighter escorts. The psychological effect on bomber crews of seeing an enemy interceptor that could appear from nowhere attack at impossible speeds and disappear before gunners could track it was significant even when actual losses were minimal. And the technological demonstration that rocket-powered flight was practical, that speeds over 600 mph could be achieved and controlled, influenced post-war aviation development, even though the specific design of the Me-163 was recognized as a dead end. The engineering lessons from the Me-163 program were substantial, but came at terrible human cost. The aircraft proved that rocket propulsion could provide performance far exceeding piston engines or even early jets. But it also demonstrated that liquid rocket engines using toxic volatile propellants were impractical for operational aircraft. The tailless swept-wing configuration showed advantages in transonic flight, but was difficult to control and offered poor handling at low speeds, where pilots spent most of their time. The concept of ultra-high-performance interceptors with minimal endurance made sense on paper, but proved impractical when the tactical reality meant pilots needed time to position attack, potentially make multiple passes, and defend themselves during the return to base. The pilots who flew the Me-163 deserve recognition for extraordinary courage, bordering on fatalism. They volunteered or were assigned to fly aircraft that everyone knew were more likely to kill them than the enemy that had already killed numerous pilots in training, and that offered minimal chance of actually achieving successful combat. They climbed into cockpits surrounded by fuels that would explode if spilled or mixed. They accelerated to speeds that threatened to tear their aircraft apart. They made split-second attacks against heavily defended bomber formations, and they glided home, hoping the landing wouldn't kill them. That any Me-163 pilot survived the war is testament to skill and luck in roughly equal measure. The broader context of the Me-163's development reveals the desperation driving late-war German aviation programs. By 1943–44, Germany was losing the air war through attrition it couldn't sustain. Conventional solutions, building more fighters, training more pilots, couldn't keep pace with Allied production and pilot training capabilities. German leadership turned to wonder weapons, jet fighters, rocket interceptors, guided missiles, hoping that technological breakthroughs could compensate for material disadvantages. The Me-163 represented the most radical of these programs, abandoning proven designs and accepting extraordinary risks in pursuit of performance advantages that might theoretically allow small numbers of highly specialized interceptors to achieve what conventional fighters couldn't. The program consumed resources that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. The specialized fuels required chemical production capacity that could have produced explosives or other war materials. The skilled labor needed to build Me-163s could have produced more conventional fighters that would have been more effective overall, even if individually less spectacular. The pilots killed in training and operations represented losses of experienced aviators, who were increasingly irreplaceable. In retrospect, the Me-163 program was almost certainly a net negative for German war efforts. It consumed more than it contributed, killed more Germans than Allies, and distracted from more practical defensive measures. But desperation drives irrational decisions, and the Me-163 represented hope, however unrealistic, that technology could still achieve what strategy and resources couldn't. The post-war fate of captured Me-163s illustrates the aircraft's technical importance despite its operational failure. The Allies captured numerous Komets, some intact, and subjected them to exhaustive testing and analysis. American, British, and Soviet engineers studied every aspect of the design, particularly the rocket propulsion system and the swept wing configuration. While no nation directly copied the Me-163, its flaws were two obvious elements of its design, influenced post-war rocket and jet aircraft development. The understanding that swept wings and rocket propulsion could achieve transonic speeds informed research programs that eventually led to supersonic flight. In this sense, the Me-163's legacy was in what it taught about what not to do as much as what it demonstrated was possible. Several Me-163s survive in museums today, preserved as examples of radical wartime innovation and as reminders of the human costs of desperate technological development. These aircraft sit silent and inert, their fuel tanks empty of the deadly propellants that made them simultaneously revolutionary and lethal, their rocket engines cold and safe in ways they never were operationally. Visitors can observe the cramped cockpit, the stubby airframe, the retractable skid landing system, and try to imagine what it would have been like to fly this aircraft into combat, knowing that the greatest threat wasn't enemy fire, but the aircraft itself. The Me-163 Komet stands as one of aviation history's most paradoxical aircraft, revolutionary and obsolete, innovative and impractical, faster than anything in the sky, yet more dangerous to its own pilots than to the enemy. It achieved speeds that wouldn't be matched for years and demonstrated technologies that influenced post-war aviation, yet it killed more Germans than Allies and consumed resources that Germany desperately needed. It represented both the pinnacle of German engineering ingenuity and the desperation of a losing war that drove innovation past the point of practicality into deadly experimentation. The pilots who flew it showed courage that deserved better aircraft. The engineers who designed it showed brilliance that deserved better strategic situation, and the aircraft itself showed what was possible when performance was pursued without adequate consideration for practicality, safety, or tactical reality. The rocket interceptor that flew too fast remains a cautionary tale about the limits of technological solutions to strategic problems. Germany needed interceptors that could defend against Allied bombers, and the Me-163 could reach bomber altitude faster than any other aircraft. But speed alone wasn't enough. Endurance mattered, safety mattered, the ability to make multiple attacks and defend during the return mattered, and the Me-163 sacrificed all of these for speed that proved insufficient to change the war's outcome. The aircraft that climbed vertically at 16,000 feet per minute, attacked at 600 miles per hour, and then glided home helplessly represented German innovation at its most impressive, and German desperation at its most evident. It was the plane that flew too fast, and in flying too fast it flew past practicality into a realm where brilliance and futility became indistinguishable, where the future of aviation and the death of pilots merged in the cramped cockpit of a stubby rocket-powered dart that killed more friends than enemies, yet remains one of World War II's most technically significant aircraft.